An obese 8-year-old was sold to an Amish man as punishment by her father, but he had shocking plans. In a dusty frontier town, the crowd roared with laughter as a cruel father dragged his daughter onto the auction block. The jeers cut deeper than any whip, but then boots scraped the floor. A silent Amish man stepped forward and bought her. Everyone thought she was doomed. But instead of chains, he offered freedom. Instead of shame, he offered a place among outcasts, widows, and orphans on a hidden refuge farm where the broken could begin again. Yet whispers spread like wildfire. Her father was coming back with the law at his side. And behind him, the railroad hungered for the very land she now called home. Now with her past bearing down on her, one question burns like fire across the prairie. Was she rescued, or only traded into a battle even more dangerous than before? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The smoky haze of the saloon hung thick in the air, mingling with cruel laughter and the sharp tang of spilled whiskey. Chloe Whitcomb stumbled as her father's iron grip yanked her onto the rickety platform. Her cheeks burned with shame as the wooden boards creaked beneath her feet. "Take a good look, boys," her father bellowed, his words slurring. "My worthless daughter here needs a man to take her off my hands." He gestured wildly at Chloe's heavy-set frame, earning another round of harsh laughter from the crowd till Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, trying to become smaller. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the room, and she wished she could disappear into them. Her heart hammered against her ribs as ranch hands and drifters called out mock bids. "2 bits for the fat girl. I'll give you a wooden nickel." "How about a broken saddle?" Each taunt cut deeper than the last. Tears threatened to spill from Chloe's eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Her father swayed on his feet, face red with drink and spite. "Come on now, surely she's worth more than that. Who'll give me a real bid?" The saloon door creaked open, letting in a shaft of evening light. A tall figure in plain dark clothing stepped inside. The man's simple Amish garb stood out starkly among the rough Western wear of the other patrons. He moved with a slight limp, but his steps were purposeful as he made his way through the crowd. The room grew quiet as James Stoltzfus approached the platform. His calm presence seemed to part the sea of mockery. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. "I will give you $50, James said, his voice steady and clear. The laughter died completely. Chloe's father's smirk froze on his face as James counted out the bills, real money, not the jest-filled bids of before. Chloe dared to look at James directly. His eyes met hers, filled not with the cruel amusement or base interest she'd seen in others, but with something entirely different: respect, dignity. Her trembling eased slightly. Her father snatched the money, thumbing through it with greedy satisfaction. His plan had worked better than he'd hoped. He'd rid himself of his burden and turned a profit. He shoved Chloe toward James with a barking laugh. "She's all yours, plain man. Hope you know what you're getting yourself into." But James stepped back, making no move to grab her. "Miss Whitcomb is free to make her own choice." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Chloe's breath caught in her throat as their meaning sank in. Free? The concept seemed foreign after so many years under her father's harsh rule. Later, as the sun sank toward the horizon, Chloe sat on a wooden bench outside the saloon. Her father was still inside, celebrating his newfound wealth. The evening air felt clean after the smoky interior, but she still felt soiled by the afternoon's events. The soft clip-clop of hooves made her look up. James approached in a simple wagon drawn by a sturdy brown horse. He brought the wagon to a stop near her bench. "Miss Whitcomb," he said softly, "would you like a ride? There's room in my wagon, if you choose to accept." Chloe studied him, searching for any hint of deception. But his face remained open and honest, his offer sincere. Why? She whispered. Why would you help me? Because every soul deserves dignity, James replied simply. What happened in there was wrong. You are not property to be sold. You are a child of God, and you deserve to choose your own path. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, chasing away some of the afternoon's chill. Chloe stood slowly, her legs still shaky. What happens if I go with you? She asked. You begin your life as a free woman, James said. Nothing more, nothing less. The choice is yours, Miss Whitcomb. The saloon door banged open behind her, spilling light and raucous laughter onto the street. The sound made Chloe flinch. She looked at the wagon, then back at the saloon where her father's voice rang out, demanding another bottle. With trembling fingers, she reached for James's offered hand and climbed into the wagon. The wooden seat was worn but solid beneath her, so different from the shameful platform of hours before. As James clicked to the horse and the wagon began to move, Chloe felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope. The wagon wheels groaned against the packed dirt road as they left the town behind. Chloe perched on the edge of the wooden seat, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. The evening air grew colder, and coyotes called to each other across the darkening prairie. Their mournful howls matched the ache in her heart. James handled the reins with quiet confidence, guiding his horse along the rutted path. The steady clip-clop of hooves provided a rhythm to their journey. After several minutes of silence, he spoke in his measured way. I have a farm, he said, though it's different from most. It's a place of refuge for those who need shelter and peace. He paused, letting his words settle in the cool air. Widows who've lost their homes, children with no families, people who've been cast aside by others. Chloe stole a glance at his profile, trying to understand. His kind words seemed too good to be true after years of harsh treatment. And you help them all? We help each other, James answered. Everyone contributes what they can. Some cook, others tend the garden or care for the animals. There's dignity in honest work. He turned to meet her eyes briefly. You're welcome to stay and help if you wish. The choice is yours. The wagon rolled past a familiar stretch of land, and Chloe's breath caught in her throat. Her father's ranch house stood on a low hill, golden lamplight spilling from its windows. Even from the road, she could hear angry shouting her father's voice, no doubt spending his new wealth on more whiskey. Her younger siblings would be huddled in their rooms, trying to stay quiet and unseen. Chloe pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting back tears. She might never see them again. The thought twisted in her chest like a knife. But what could she do? She couldn't protect them. She couldn't even protect herself. The night deepened as they continued, on stars appearing one by one in the vast prairie sky. Finally, James turned the wagon onto a narrow track that led to his farmstead. A simple barn loomed in the darkness, and beside it stood a sturdy cabin. Warm light glowed from its windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney into the night. James brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin's door. Welcome to our refuge, he said softly. Inside, the cabin was alive with activity. Women moved about a large cooking hearth, stirring what smelled like beef stew. Children wrapped in colorful quilts sat near the fire, some reading by lamplight, others playing quiet games with wooden toys. The scene was so different from the chaos of her father's house that Chloe felt momentarily dizzy. Tall woman with silver-streaked hair approached them, wiping her hands on her apron. I'm Margaret Ellis, she said, her voice warm but direct. Welcome to our home. The other women looked up from their tasks, offering small smiles. Their faces showed caution, but also understanding. These were people who knew what it meant to need shelter from the world. Thank you, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you hungry? Margaret asked. The stew's nearly ready. Before Chloe could answer, her stomach growled loudly. A few of the children giggled, but not unkindly. Color flooded Chloe's cheeks. "I'll take that as a yes," Margaret said with a gentle laugh. She gestured to an empty chair at the long wooden table. "Sit, rest. You're safe here." James excused himself to tend to the horse and barn, leaving Chloe with the others. A bowl of steaming stew appeared before her, along with a thick slice of brown bread. The rich aroma brought tears to her eyes. When had she last eaten a proper meal? After supper, Margaret showed her to the loft where she would sleep. A narrow bed waited, piled with clean blankets and a plump pillow. "Get some rest," Margaret said. "Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out what comes next." Alone in the loft, Chloe lay on the soft bed, staring up at the rough-hewn rafters. The wooden beams glowed faintly in the light from the dying fire below. She could hear quiet conversation, the occasional laugh, the crackle of the hearth. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. Her mind spun with the day's events, the humiliation at the saloon, James's unexpected kindness, this strange new place with its welcoming inhabitants. Part of her waited for the other shoe to drop, for someone to reveal this was all an elaborate joke. But another part, a tiny spark deep inside, dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found something real. Sleep tugged at her edges, but fear of tomorrow kept her awake. What would be expected of her? How long? Would they let her stay? Could she trust this unexpected kindness? Questions chased each other through her mind as she watched. Shadows dance across the rafters above. The first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin windows, bringing with them the mouth-watering aroma of fresh-baked bread. Chloe stirred in her loft bed, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Below, women's voices lifted in gentle harmony, singing Amazing Grace. Outside, children's laughter rang clear in the crisp morning air. Chloe dressed quickly and climbed down the ladder. In the kitchen, Margaret Ellis kneaded dough while two other women pulled golden loaves from the brick oven. They nodded warmly at her, continuing their hymn without pause. James appeared in the doorway, his plain black hat in hand. "Good morning," he said. "Would you like to learn about the morning chores?" Chloe nodded, following him outside. The autumn air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby woods. James walked with his slight limp toward the barn, explaining as they went. "The cows need milking first," he said, demonstrating how to position the bucket and settle onto the low stool. "Then we'll chop wood for the cookstove and fetch water from the creek." Chloe's first attempts at milking were awkward. Her large hands fumbled with the unfamiliar motion, but the cow stood patient and calm. After a few minutes, she found her rhythm. The steady stream of milk hitting the bucket became almost musical. "You have a good touch," James observed. "Gentle. The animals respond well to that." Next came the woodpile. James showed her how to swing the axe, but Chloe worried her size would make her clumsy. To her surprise, her strong arms proved perfect for the task. The axe felt natural in her hands, and soon she had a neat stack of split logs. 3 small children watched from behind a wagon wheel, whispering and giggling. When Chloe smiled at them, they scampered over instead of running away. A little girl with braided hair pointed at the axe. "You're strong," she exclaimed. "Like my papa was. Can you show me how to do that?" "Maybe when you're bigger," Chloe said, her heart warming at the child's admiration rather than mockery of her size. The water carrying proved challenging, but not because of difficulty. The children insisted on helping, which meant splashing and playing as they made trips to and from the creek. Their laughter was infectious, and Chloe found herself smiling more than she had in years. After the morning chores, the women gathered in the cabin's main room to mend clothes and tell stories. Chloe sat with them, working on a torn shirt while she listened. Each widow shared her tale of loss and survival. "My Thomas died in the war," one woman said softly, her needle moving steadily through fabric. "Confederate artillery at Gettysburg." I couldn't keep the farm alone. Another spoke of losing her husband to a mining accident, while a third described being abandoned with 3 small children. Their pain felt familiar to Chloe, the same ache of being deemed worthless, cast aside. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, James joined them. He sat in a worn armchair, his hands folded carefully in his lap. I dream of making this place truly self-sufficient, he explained, his quiet voice filled with purpose. A community where everyone contributes, according to their gifts, where no one is rejected for being different. He glanced at his own twisted leg. The world can be cruel to those who don't fit its mold. But here, we see the worth in each soul. The women nodded in understanding. Chloe felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the simple dignity in his words. When evening came, everyone gathered around the long table. Lamplight cast a warm glow over their faces as Margaret led them in prayer. The aroma of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air, and children fidgeted in their seats, eager to eat. Chloe bowed her head with the others, but her mind wandered to her father. She could almost hear his sneering voice. Who'd want a useless girl like you? The memory made her hands tremble. This peace she'd found, this acceptance and purpose, seemed too precious to last. Surely the world would find a way to take it from her, just as it had taken everything else. She opened her eyes to find James watching her with gentle concern. Around the table, faces glowed in the lamplight, faces that had shown her only kindness. The children who had played with her at the creek, the women who had shared their stories, Margaret's steady presence. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, but still, fear whispered in her heart. How long could this last? How long before the cruel world beyond their refuge came to shatter this fragile peace? The next morning dawned clear and cool. James hitched his horses to the wagon while Chloe wrapped herself in a borrowed shawl. They were heading to the weekly church gathering. A 10-mile journey over rough dirt roads. The wagon creaked and swayed as they made their way across the prairie. Tall grass rippled like waves in the autumn breeze. The slow pace and gentle motion of the wagon created a peaceful atmosphere that invited conversation. I reckon you might want to know how I came to start the refuge, James said softly, his hands steady on the reins. It wasn't always my plan. Chloe turned to look at him, noting how the morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair. I worked for the railroad once, he continued, adjusting his position to ease his twisted leg. Loading cargo, laying track. One day, a loaded freight car broke loose on a grade. I tried to stop it, got caught underneath. He paused, his voice growing distant. Lost some friends that day. The company called it an accident, paid a small settlement. The wagon wheel hit a rut, making them both bounce. James waited for the motion to settle before speaking again. My people, the Amish, we believe in peace. No fighting, no lawsuits. Some folks take that as weakness. Call us cowards. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. But there's strength in choosing mercy over vengeance. Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, gathering courage. I've never been strong, she whispered. Papa always said I was worthless. Too big, too slow, too much trouble to feed. James shook his head firmly. The good book says we're all fearfully and wonderfully made. God doesn't make mistakes, Chloe. The church came into view, a simple white building with a tall steeple. Wagons and horses already crowded the yard. Chloe's stomach tightened at the sight of so many strangers. As they climbed down from the wagon, curious eyes turned their way. Whispers followed them up the church steps. Chloe heard fragments. That's the girl from the saloon. Stoltzfus bought her. Size of her. Inside, they found seats near the widows from the refuge. Margaret Ellis squeezed Chloe's hand in silent support. The service began with a hymn, the congregation rising to sing, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." During the second verse, a group of children turned around in their pews, watching Chloe with wide eyes. One little girl tugged at her skirt. "Sing with us," she whispered eagerly. "Please?" Chloe hesitated, but the child's smile was impossible to resist. She opened her mouth and let her voice join the others. Her deep, rich alto filled the church, harmonizing perfectly with the melody. People turned to look, but this time their expressions held surprise and appreciation rather than judgment. When the hymn ended, several congregation members nodded approvingly. The widows from the refuge beamed with pride. James, sitting beside her, smiled warmly. The rest of the service passed in a blur of scripture readings and prayers. Afterward, during the social hour, several women approached to compliment Chloe's singing. For the first time in her life, she felt seen for a gift rather than mocked for a flaw. The ride home was quieter, with dusk painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Chloe felt lighter somehow, as if some of her shame had been left behind in that white church. Still, old fears flickered at the edges of her mind, refusing to fully disappear. They arrived at the refuge just as the first stars appeared. The cabin glowed with lamplight, promising warmth and supper. But something felt wrong. The usual evening chatter was missing, replaced by tense whispers. Margaret met them at the door, her face tight with worry. "Word came while you were gone," she said in a low voice. "Your father's been making threats in town. Says James tricked him, that the sale wasn't legal. He's talking about coming to take you back." The news hit Chloe like a physical blow. Her legs went weak, and she grabbed the doorframe for support. All the peace she'd found that day vanished in an instant. Inside the cabin, the refuge community huddled together, speaking in anxious murmurs. The children sensed the tension, staying close to their mothers. Even the lamplight seemed dimmer, as if sharing their fear. Chloe stood frozen, her father's cruel face swimming before her eyes. She knew what he was capable of when angry. The thought of him coming here, bringing his violence to this peaceful place, made her blood run cold. Dawn crept over the refuge with a heaviness that seemed to press against the windows. Chloe stood at the kitchen table, her usually steady hands trembling as she worked the bread dough. The familiar task offered little comfort today. Every sound from outside, hoofbeats on the road, branches scraping the roof, made her flinch. Margaret Ellis worked beside her, adding more flour to the mixture. "Keep kneading, child," she encouraged softly. "Work helps settle the mind." James entered the kitchen, his limp more pronounced in the morning stiffness. He carried an armload of kindling for the stove. "The Lord provides," he said, meeting Chloe's worried gaze. "We'll stand firm together." Through the open door, Chloe could hear two widows talking in low voices near the well. Their words drifted in on the morning breeze. "Deputies always side with the landowners. Might bring trouble to us all." Chloe's fingers dug into the dough, leaving deep impressions. The weight of guilt pressed harder than ever on her shoulders. These good people had taken her in, shown her kindness, and now her presence threatened their peace. The morning passed in tense silence. Children played more quietly than usual, sensing the adults' unease. Chloe moved through her chores mechanically, starting at every distant sound. Just after the midday meal, thundering hoofbeats approached up the lane. Everyone froze. James moved to the door, standing tall despite his twisted leg. A rider on a lathered horse pulled up in a cloud of dust. "Mr. Stoltzfus." The man, a neighbor from 3 miles down, dismounted quickly. "Thought you ought to know. Whitcomb's been to the county clerk's office. He's raising a mighty fuss, claiming you took his daughter unlawful-like." The news hit the household like a physical blow. One of the younger children started crying, quickly hushed by his mother. James thanked the neighbor, who remounted and rode away, clearly glad to deliver his message and depart. Inside the cabin, James gathered everyone together. "We'll pray," he said simply. His voice carried the quiet authority that had first drawn Chloe's attention in the saloon. Our refuge is built on truth and God's love, not lies. We'll face this trial together." They formed a circle, holding hands. James's prayer rang with conviction, asking for protection and wisdom, but Chloe barely heard the words. Shame and fear twisted inside her like serpents. Her father's rage would bring destruction to this peaceful place, and it would be her fault. As evening approached, Chloe slipped out to tend the chickens. The simple task usually brought her joy: the soft clucking, the warm eggs, the peaceful pecking. Today, tears rolled down her cheeks as she scattered feed on the ground. "Chloe." She startled at James's voice behind her. Quickly wiping her eyes, she turned to face him. "I should go," she whispered. "Before he comes. Before anyone gets hurt." "No." James's voice was firm but gentle. He stepped closer, his eyes intense in the fading light. "You are worth every risk. Every one of us here has faced rejection, been cast aside. That's why we stand together. But my father is wrong." James reached out, hesitated, then carefully took her hand. "You have value beyond measure, Chloe, not as property to be sold. But as a child of God, we will not abandon you to cruelty." The sincerity in his voice reached past her fears, steadying her trembling heart. For a moment, they stood in silence as the evening wind rustled through the corn. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, bringing an early darkness. Inside the cabin, lamps were already being lit, their warm glow spilling from the windows. "Come inside," James said softly. "Storm's coming." They hurried to the house as the first heavy drops began to fall. The wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, Margaret had set extra lamps burning, their flames steady against the growing darkness. The children huddled together, whispering stories to distract themselves from the thunder. Chloe took her place among them, accepting a cup of hot tea from one of the widows. The storm raged outside, but within these walls, surrounded by this chosen family, she felt her resolve strengthen. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight, at least they were together. The hours crept by, marked by flashes of lightning and rumbles of thunder. No one suggested going to bed early. They sat together, praying, talking softly, waiting for whatever news tomorrow might bring. The days crept by under watchful eyes at the refuge. Chloe fell into a steady rhythm of work that left her muscles aching, but her heart fuller than before. Each morning brought new tasks: hauling water from the creek in heavy buckets that made her arms tremble, carefully mending torn quilts by lamplight as the widows taught her their stitching secrets, and rocking fussy infants to sleep while their mothers tended to other chores. Yet beneath the daily routine, tension lingered like smoke after a prairie fire. Every approaching rider made heads turn. Every distant shout brought silence to the house. The children played closer to the cabin now, and James took to watching the road more often than before. One warm afternoon, as Chloe helped Margaret hang washing on the line, the clip-clop of hooves announced a visitor. A stranger approached on horseback, a man in a crisp black coat that seemed out of place against the dusty landscape. His horse was well-groomed, its saddle polished, and new. James emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his plain work shirt. As he walked to meet the visitor, Chloe moved closer to the cabin's corner, close enough to hear while keeping to the shadows. "Mr. Stoltzfus?" The stranger dismounted smoothly, revealing a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "Silas Morton, agent for the Western Railroad Company." He pulled several papers from his case, consulting them with practiced efficiency. "I notice you've made some improvements to this property." James stood quietly, his hands clasped before him. "We have been blessed with good harvests." Morton unfolded a larger document, a survey map marked with precise lines and measurements. "According to our records, this farmstead sits directly in the path of a planned railroad spur line, essential for regional development, you understand." Chloe's heart began to pound. She watched James's face, searching for signs of concern, but his expression remained calm. The company is prepared to offer fair compensation for the property. Morton named a sum that made several of the watching women gasp. It would be enough to establish yourself elsewhere, Mr. Stoltzfus. Somewhere more suitable. James's voice remained steady. This land was purchased legally. We have built a community here. Community? Morton's smile didn't reach his eyes. I see a collection of... He paused, glancing at the widows and children watching from the porch. Temporary residents. The railroad's claim will prevail, Mr. Stoltzfus. Eviction is inevitable. Better to accept a generous offer now than face legal proceedings later. Friend, James said quietly, this land was entrusted to our stewardship. We cannot simply abandon those who depend upon it. Stewardship? Morton folded his maps with sharp movements. The age of small farms is ending, Mr. Stoltzfus. Progress cannot be stopped by sentiment or... His gaze took in James's plain clothes. Religious conviction. Then we shall face that challenge when it comes, James replied. But today I must decline thy offer. Morton mounted his horse with fluid grace, looking down at James. Consider carefully, Mr. Stoltzfus. The company's patience is not endless. He turned his horse, then added over his shoulder, I'll return for your answer soon. The evening meal was subdued. Margaret ladled out bowls of thick stew while worried whispers circulated around the long table. The widows voiced their fears in hushed tones. Where would we go? The children are just settling in. Can they truly force us out? James listened to each concern, counseling calm and trust in God's provision. But Chloe, watching him from across the table, saw the weariness in his eyes. His shoulders, usually so straight, seemed to carry an invisible weight. Later, as darkness settled over the refuge, Chloe knelt beside her bed in the loft. The wooden floors creaked beneath her knees. As she bowed her head, Please, Lord, she whispered, her voice catching. Let me stay with this family you've given me. Don't let them take away our home. She paused, listening to the night sounds of the house. A baby's soft cry, a mother's gentle shushing, the settling of timbers. These good people took me in when no one else would. Please, show us a way to keep this place safe. Through the window, she could see James's figure moving slowly near the barn, checking the animals one last time. His limp was more pronounced. Tonight, his movements betraying the strain of the day's confrontation. The railroad agent's threats hung over the refuge like storm clouds. Their sanctuary, so recently found, now seemed as fragile as morning mist. Chloe pulled her quilt tighter, remembering the agent's cold smile, the sharp edges of his maps that sought to cut their community into pieces. But as she listened to the peaceful breathing of the children sleeping nearby, felt the solid walls of the cabin around her, Chloe clung to hope. This place had already survived her father's threats. Somehow they would find a way to weather this new storm together. The next morning dawned bitter cold, with frost glittering across the ground like scattered diamonds. Chloe pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped out of the cabin, her breath forming little clouds in the crisp air. James stood by the barn, already checking the wagon's wheels for the journey into town. Good morning, he called softly. I trust thee slept well. Chloe nodded, moving to help him with the horses. Her fingers trembled slightly as she helped secure the harnesses, but not from the cold. The thought of returning to town, where just days ago she had faced such humiliation, made her stomach twist. James seemed to sense her unease. We need not go if thee feels unsafe, he offered, his voice gentle. No, Chloe said firmly, surprising herself. We need supplies. I won't hide. Forever. The journey took hours, their horse plodding steadily through rutted roads that wound between frost-covered fields. The wagon creaked and swayed beneath them as they rode side by side. Chloe sat straight-backed, fighting the urge to hunch her shoulders and make herself smaller. For the first time, she was riding openly beside James, not cowering in the back like cargo dot as they approached town. Familiar buildings came into view, the general store, the saloon where her nightmare had begun, the telegraph office with its clicking sounds carrying on the morning air. People stopped to stare as their wagon rolled past. Chloe heard the whispers, saw the pointing fingers. "Look at that fat girl with the plainclothes farmer," one man scoffed to his companion. "Ain't that Whitcomb's daughter?" James's hands tightened on the reins, but his expression remained serene. Chloe lifted her chin higher, though her heart pounded dot at the mercantile. James helped her down from the wagon. The store bell jingled as they entered, and the familiar smell of coffee beans and leather goods filled the air. While James discussed seed prices with the owner, Chloe approached the cloth counter. Her legs felt wooden, but she forced herself forward. "I'd like 3 yards of muslin, please," she said clearly to the clerk, her voice stronger than she expected. "And some thread to match." The clerk raised his eyebrows, but measured out the fabric without comment. Chloe felt a small surge of pride. She had made a purchase on her own, speaking up without stammering or apologizing for existing dot as she waited for her package to be wrapped. A small hand tugged at her skirt. She looked down to find a little girl with braided hair smiling up at her. "Miss," the child said sweetly, "could you help me reach that candy jar?" Chloe's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Miss, such a simple word of respect, yet she had rarely heard it directed at her. She helped the little girl, blinking back tears, while James loaded their purchases, seed sacks, nails, and other supplies, onto the wagon. Raised voices from the saloon caught their attention. Through the swinging doors came the sound of her father's familiar bellow. "That holy roller thinks he can steal my property?" His words were slurred with whiskey despite the early hour. "Well, me and Deputy Hollis are gonna pay him a visit real soon. Show him what happens when you cross Jack Whitcomb." Chloe's hands began to shake. She looked at James, seeing the concern in his eyes despite his calm demeanor. "He means to come to the refuge," she whispered, "with the law behind him." James helped her up onto the wagon seat. "The law of man may support him," he said quietly, "but God's justice is stronger. We must trust in that." They departed as dusk was falling, the wagon's lantern swaying gently as they made their slow way home. The cold had deepened, and Chloe huddled closer to James for warmth. Every creak of the wagon, every distant sound made her start, imagining her father and the deputy riding hard behind them. The lantern light caught James's profile as he spoke. "I know thee is afraid," he said softly. "But remember, thee is not alone anymore. The whole refuge stands with thee now." Chloe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The wagon rocked beneath them as they continued through the gathering darkness toward home and whatever trials awaited them there. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, with morning sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. Chloe smoothed her borrowed dress, a simple brown cotton garment that Widow Ellis had helped her alter. Her fingers traced the careful stitches as she prepared for church, remembering how the older women had gathered around to help her feel presentable. The small church sat nestled among cottonwood trees, its white-painted boards gleaming in the morning light. As their wagon approached, Chloe could see other families arriving, their Sunday best a splash of color against the prairie backdrop. Her heart fluttered with nervous anticipation. Inside, the wooden pews creaked as people settled in. Sunlight filtered through plain glass windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. The widows from the refuge gathered near the front, making space for Chloe among them. She felt their quiet strength beside her, so different from the mockery she had known before. When it came time for the hymns, Widow Ellis gently nudged Chloe to stand. The other women rose with her, their worn hymnals open. Chloe took a deep breath, and as the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the air, she let her voice join theirs. Her rich alto rose clear and strong, carrying the melody with unexpected power. The congregation fell silent for a moment before joining in, many turning to look at the source of such beautiful singing. Chloe kept her eyes on the hymnal, but she could feel their surprise, not mockery, but appreciation. Through Rock of Ages and What a Friend We Have in Jesus, Chloe's confidence grew. Her voice soared to the rafters, blending with the other women's in perfect harmony. When she dared to glance up, she caught James watching her from his seat. His eyes held such warmth and admiration that her heart skipped a beat. After the service, people approached to compliment her singing. "Such a gift," one elderly woman said, patting Chloe's hand. "You must join the choir." Children who had once stared now smiled up at her. One little girl even asked if Chloe would teach her the songs. Ride home seemed to pass in a golden haze. The late afternoon sun painted the prairie grass in shades of amber and bronze. James drove the wagon unhurriedly, letting the horse set its own pace. Chloe sat beside him, her hymnal clutched to her chest, allowing herself to dream, she imagined. More Sundays like this one, standing proud among friends, her voice lifted in praise. She pictured quiet evenings in the refuge, perhaps someday sitting beside James not just as a member of his community, but as something more. The thought made her cheeks warm, but for once she didn't try to dismiss such hopes as foolish. Back at the farmhouse, the joyful mood continued through supper. The long table was crowded with plates of beans, cornbread, and late summer vegetables from their garden. Children squeezed together on benches, their faces shining. Even the newest widow, usually so quiet, joined in when someone started another hymn. Laughter and song filled the usually quiet house. Chloe helped serve apple pie while the little ones begged for stories. James sat in his usual place by the hearth, contentment clear on his face as he watched his makeshift family celebrate together. As the evening deepened and lanterns were being lit for night prayers, hoofbeats approached through the darkness. The singing stopped abruptly. James rose, moving to the window with careful steps. A rider appeared in the lantern light. Tom Wheeler, their closest neighbor. His face was grave as James met him at the door. "Thought you ought to know," Wheeler said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Jack Whitcomb was in town today, drunk and boasting. Says he's got papers to annul the sale, forged documents claiming you tricked him. He's convinced Deputy Hollis to ride out here with him, probably within days." The joy that had filled the house moments before drained away like water through sand. Chloe felt the familiar cold grip of fear seize her heart. The widows drew closer together, while the children sensed the tension and grew still. "He means to take me back," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible in the fearful silence that had fallen over the refuge. James thanked Wheeler for the warning, and the neighbor rode away into the night. The house remained quiet, the earlier happiness shattered by the threat of what was coming. The lanterns cast long shadows on the walls as everyone looked to James, waiting to hear what they would do. The evening songs were forgotten. Even the smallest children seemed to understand that their peaceful sanctuary was about to face its greatest test. Chloe stood frozen by the hearth, the hymnal still clutched in her trembling hands, as the refuge fell into deep and fearful silence. Gray morning light crept through the cabin windows, matching Chloe's heavy heart. The wooden butter churn felt heavier than usual as she worked the plunger up and down, her arms moving mechanically while her thoughts churned with worry. The steady thump-splash rhythm usually brought her peace, but today it only marked time, passing until her father's inevitable arrival. Through the window, she watched storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and threatening. The air felt thick with coming rain, making everything seem closer, more immediate. Inside the cabin, the usual morning bustle felt subdued. Children spoke in whispers, and the widows exchanged worried glances as they went about their tasks. James entered from outside, his boots leaving mud prints on the wooden floor. He carried himself differently today, Shoulders tense, steps measured. When his eyes met Chloe's, she saw his concern plain as day. "Might we speak?" he asked quietly. Chloe nodded, following him to the corner by the hearth where they could talk. Without being overheard, the fire crackled softly, throwing dancing shadows on the wall. "I've been thinking on the law," James said, his voice low and troubled. "Deputy Hollis, he's not a bad man, but he bends easy to pressure, and your father has influence with the wealthy ranchers." Chloe's hands twisted in her apron. "What should I do?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "Should I fight?" "Hide." "Somewhere. Maybe if I ran." James shook his head slowly. "Violence solves nothing. It only breeds more violence." "And running," he sighed heavily. "That would only prove their lies about us true." "Then what?" Chloe asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We stand firm in faith," James said, his quiet conviction filling his words. "Truth is on our side. God sees it, even if the law turns blind eyes." The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every distant sound made Chloe start, a door creaking, a branch scratching against windows, the wind picking up as the storm drew closer. She tried to keep busy, but her hands shook as she worked. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Chloe helped the children prepare for bed. Little Sarah, barely 6 years old, clung to her hand as she tucked the worn quilt around her small shoulders. "Miss Chloe?" Sarah's voice was small in the dimness. "Will you always stay here with us?" The innocent question pierced Chloe's heart. She smoothed Sarah's hair back from her forehead, unable to answer for a moment. "I want to," she finally managed, her throat tight, more than anything. Outside, the storm broke with fury. Rain lashed against the cabin walls while thunder rolled across the prairie. The wind howled through every crack and crevice, making the shutters rattle like angry fists pounding to get in. Chloe lay in her bed in the loft, fully dressed, staring into the darkness. Every crash of thunder made her flinch. She counted the seconds between lightning flashes, listening intently for sounds that didn't belong to the storm. The other women and children slept fitfully, some whimpering in their dreams in the darkest hour before dawn. When the storm had finally begun to ease, Chloe heard it, the sound she'd been dreading. Hoofbeats approaching, multiple horses splashing through mud. Then lantern light flickered through the windows, casting weird shadows on the cabin walls. "Whitcomb!" A man's voice bellowed through the rain. "Bring the girl out." The whole refuge stirred awake. Children began to cry softly, quickly hushed by the widows who gathered them close. Chloe sat up, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "I know you're in there, girl." Her father's voice, rough with whiskey even at this hour, made her blood run cold. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." James's steady footsteps crossed the cabin floor below. Chloe heard him pause at the door, heard his quiet prayer. Then the door creaked open, and she could picture him standing there in his plain dark clothes, facing down anger with nothing but faith for armor. "You have no right to keep her." Her father shouted, "I've got papers here saying that sale wasn't legal. Deputy Hollis is here to enforce the law." The refuge huddled together in the darkness, holding each other, waiting. Chloe gripped the rough wooden beam beside her bed, feeling splinters dig into her palm. Outside, the confrontation was about to begin, and everything she had found here, peace, purpose, belonging, maybe even love, hung by a thread in the stormy night. Rain drummed against the muddy ground as James stood in the doorway, his quiet strength a sharp contrast to the angry men before him. Lightning flashed, illuminating Deputy Hollis's uncertain face and the rage twisting Chloe's father's features. Water streamed from the brim of Mr. Whitcomb's hat as he thrust a stack of papers toward James. "These papers say that sale wasn't legal," Whitcomb shouted over another crack of thunder. "You tricked me when I wasn't in my right mind." James remained still, his voice steady despite the storm. "Friend, thee knows that's not true. The sale was witnessed by half the town. Deputy Hollis shifted in his saddle, rainwater dripping from his oilskin coat. "Mr. Stoltzfus, if there's legal cause to doubt the sale—" "There ain't no doubt," Whitcomb interrupted, waving the papers. "These prove it. Now hand over my property." From inside the cabin, Chloe could hear every word. Her heart pounded as she listened to them arguing about her fate as if she were a horse or cow to be traded. The children huddled closer to her, their small hands gripping her skirts. She looked down at their frightened faces, thinking of how many times she had wished for someone to stand up for her when she was their age. "The law must be properly examined," James insisted, his voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "These documents deserve careful consideration, not hasty judgment." In the dark, something in James's calm words gave Chloe strength. Before she could second-guess herself, she was moving toward the door. James turned as she approached, his eyes widening with concern. "Chloe, no," he whispered, but she had already stepped past him into the rain-dot water immediately soaked through her dress as she faced the mounted men. Her father's face twisted with disgust at the sight of her, but she forced herself to stand straight despite her trembling. "I am not property," she declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "Deputy Hollis, please, you must hear me. I'm a person, not something to be bought and sold." "Shut your mouth, girl," her father roared. "You've been nothing but worthless since the day you were born. Too big to be proper, too slow to be useful." His words stung like they always had, but this time Chloe didn't shrink away. "I cook and clean here. I help with the children. I sing. In church, the people here value me for who I am, not what I look like." Deputy Hollis pulled his horse back a step, clearly uncomfortable with the scene before him. His eyes moved from the papers in his hands to Chloe's determined face, then to James's steady presence beside her. "Mr. Whitcomb," the deputy said slowly, "these papers, I need to examine them more carefully, in proper light. Something about the clerk's seal doesn't look quite right." "What?" Whitcomb sputtered. "You're supposed to be enforcing the law, not questioning it." The first gray light of dawn was breaking through the clouds as Deputy Hollis straightened in his saddle. "That's exactly what I'm doing, sir. These documents need to be verified at the county office. I'll return by week's end with final judgment." Chloe's father's face turned dark with fury. He yanked his horse's head around, mud spraying from its hooves. "This ain't over," he shouted. "I'll be back with the full force of the law behind me. You'll see what becomes of people who steal from Jeremiah Whitcomb." The thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance as father and deputy rode away. Chloe stood in the rain, shaking now not from fear but from the cold and the aftermath of her courage. James gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Come inside before you catch your death," he said softly. "You showed great bravery tonight." The refuge community waited anxiously inside. As Chloe entered, Sarah ran to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. The other widows hurried to bring blankets and hot tea, their faces showing both relief and worry. "What happens now?" one of the women asked as they helped Chloe dry off. James looked out the window at the lightening sky. "We pray," he said simply, "and we trust that truth will prevail over lies." Chloe sipped her tea, the warm liquid helping to still her trembling. Though fear still lurked in her heart about what the week might bring, something else burned there too. Pride in having finally stood up to her father, in having found her voice at last. Outside, the storm began to fade. But they all knew another was coming. They had until week's end to prepare for whatever judgment the deputy might bring. The refuge kitchen felt heavy with silence as James gathered everyone after breakfast. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but few hearts felt its warmth. The children sat quietly on their quilts, sensing the gravity in the adults' faces. "Let us pray," James said softly, bowing his head. "Lord, guide us through this valley." Show us your path when our own eyes cannot see the way. Chloe knelt with the others, but her prayers stuck in her throat. Her father's rage echoed in her memories, drowning out James's gentle words of faith. She had seen that look in her father's eyes before. He would never stop until he got what he wanted. The morning dragged on, each hour weighted with dread. Chloe mechanically went through her chores, barely tasting the bread she helped bake, hardly hearing the children's chatter as she hung laundry. Every distant hoofbeat made her freeze. He will win, she whispered to herself as she pumped water from the well. He always wins. The afternoon sun was slanting through the trees when widow Margaret Ellis approached Chloe at the washing tub. The older woman had been unusually quiet all day, her weathered face drawn in thought. "Child," Margaret said carefully, "there might be something." She glanced around before continuing. "Before my Herbert passed, I worked as a clerk in the county land office. Those papers your father waved around something wasn't right about them." Chloe's hands stilled in the soapy water. "What do you mean?" "The seal, the formatting, it wasn't quite proper. And I remember," Margaret's eyes lit up. "James keeps old records in his study. Would you help me look through them?" They found James in the barn, repairing a harness. When Margaret explained her suspicions, hope flickered in his steady gaze. Soon they were all crowded into his small study, carefully laying out yellowed papers and leather-bound ledgers on his desk. Margaret adjusted her spectacles, fingers tracing over dates and signatures. Here James's original land grant. Properly filed, witnessed, and sealed. She pulled another document forward. And the record of improvements. Barn raised, well dug, crops planted. All legal requirements met. "But what about my father's claim?" Chloe asked, wringing her hands. Margaret's mouth set in a determined line as she examined more papers. "That's what I thought. The seal on those annulment papers, it was the old style. The county changed it 2 years ago. And look here," she pointed to James's purchase record from the saloon. "This sale was witnessed by 12 people, including the deputy himself. It stands as a legal contract." "Meaning what?" Chloe breathed. "Meaning that when your father sold you, he legally transferred any claim of guardianship. And James's first act was to grant you freedom. It's all here in black and white." Margaret smiled triumphantly. "Your father cannot reclaim what he legally surrendered." James sat heavily in his chair, relief softening his features. "God's providence shines even in our darkest hours." Chloe's legs felt weak. She steadied herself against the desk, tears blurring her vision. "I'm truly free?" "By law and by God's grace," Margaret confirmed, patting her hand. The news spread quickly through the refuge. Children danced in the yard, the widows embraced Chloe, and even James allowed himself a rare broad smile. That evening, Chloe helped prepare supper with lighter hands than she had known in days. The stew bubbled fragrantly, biscuits turned golden in the oven, and for the first time since her father's threats began, she found herself humming as she worked. Yet even as the household shared their meal with renewed hope, Chloe noticed James's thoughtful expression. She knew her father would not accept defeat gracefully. Legal right might be on their side, but Jeremiah Whitcomb had never let the law stand between him and what he wanted. After the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into bed, Chloe knelt beside her own narrow bed in the loft. Moonlight streamed through the window, silvering her clasped hands. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for sending Margaret to us. Thank you for James's careful record-keeping. Thank you for showing us a way forward when all seemed lost." She paused, swallowing hard. "Please give us strength for whatever comes next." The floorboards creaked softly as she rose. From her window, she could see James making his final check of the barn, lanterns swinging at his side. The sight steadied her heart. Whatever her father might plan, she was no longer alone. God had given her not just one ally, but a whole community standing with her. she slipped beneath her quilt. Margaret's triumphant smile and James's quiet strength following her into dreams. For the first time in days, she slept without fear of what dawn might bring. 3 days after Margaret's discovery, the thunder of hooves broke the morning quiet. Chloe looked up from feeding chickens to see a cloud of dust rising on the road. Her heart jumped into her throat as she counted the riders, her father, Deputy Hollis, and 2 well-dressed men she didn't recognize. James emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his plain black vest. He stood calm and straight despite his slight limp, waiting as the riders approached. The widows quickly gathered the children inside, but Chloe remained rooted in place, feed bucket clutched to her chest. "Stoltzfus!" her father bellowed, swinging down from his horse. His face was red with fury and drink. Time to end this foolishness. The 2 unknown men dismounted more gracefully, their fine suits marking them as railroad agents. The taller one, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, stepped forward. "Mr. Stoltzfus, I'm Silas Morton, representing the railroad company. We've come to discuss your situation." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Whitcomb here tells us you're harboring his daughter unlawfully. Given that this land is already marked for development, perhaps we can reach an arrangement beneficial to all parties." James's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Friend, I have documents to share that may shed light on these matters." He gestured toward the house. "Deputy Hollis, would you care to review them?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably, but followed James inside. Chloe's father spat in the dirt, while Morton watched with calculated patience. Minutes stretched like molasses, until James returned with a stack of papers. "These records," James explained, "show both my legal claim to this land and the witnessed contract regarding Miss Whitcomb's freedom." He handed them to Deputy Hollis. "Margaret Ellis, formerly of the Land Office, has verified their authenticity." The deputy examined each page carefully, his expression growing more certain. "The land grant is proper," he announced. "And the sale contract from the saloon." He cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Whitcomb, you signed it yourself before 12 witnesses, including myself. The law is clear. You surrendered all claims that day." "It was a trick," Chloe's father roared. "That plain-dressed devil took advantage, the only trick." Morton interrupted smoothly. "Was your failure to mention these circumstances to us?" He studied the documents himself, frowning. "These claims appear quite lawful. The railroad has no interest in lengthy legal battles over legitimate deeds." Chloe's father turned on Morton. "You promised me good money to clear them out. Said you'd handle the girl, too. Enough." Deputy Hollis's voice cracked like a whip. "Miss Whitcomb is legally free. Mr. Stoltzfus's claim is valid, and I'll not be party to any scheme suggesting otherwise." A few townspeople had gathered at the commotion, watching from the road. They muttered among themselves as Chloe's father revealed his plotting. Several made the sign of the cross, shaking their heads at his naked greed. Morton and his associate exchanged glances. "We'll be withdrawing our interest in this property," Morton announced crisply. "Good day, Mr. Stoltzfus." They mounted their horses and rode away without a backward glance. Chloe felt strength rising in her chest like spring. "Water." She set down her bucket and walked forward, stopping just beyond arm's reach of her father. "I belong here now," she said, her voice clear and steady. "With people who see me as a daughter of God, not a burden to be sold. This is my family." Her father's face twisted. He raised his hand as if to strike her, but the watching crowd's disapproving murmur stopped him. Deputy Hollis's hand dropped meaningfully to his gun belt. "You're nothing," her father spat. "Just a worthless." "She is precious in God's sight," James cut in quietly, "and in ours. Your business here is finished, Mr. Whitcomb." Red-faced and sputtering, Chloe's father swung onto his horse. He yanked the reins so hard the animal whinnied in protest. "The lot of you can rot." He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving only dust and bitter words behind. The tension broke like a summer storm passing. The deputy touched his hat to Chloe and James before riding away. The townspeople dispersed, their gossip already spreading the tale of Jeremiah Whitcomb's shameful behavior. Inside the refuge, celebration bloomed. Children ran laughing through the rooms while the widows wiped happy tears. That evening, they gathered for a feast of Thanksgiving: fresh bread, roast chicken, and summer vegetables from their own gardens. Chloe looked around the long table, at beaming faces lit golden by lamplight. Her heart felt full enough to burst. James offered a prayer of gratitude, his quiet voice carrying to every corner of the room. Lord, we thank you for victory won not by might, but by truth, for justice upheld, for community preserved, and for showing us once again that your light overcomes all darkness. Amen, Chloe whispered, and the word tasted like freedom on her tongue. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the refuge as autumn settled across the land. Chloe's days fell into a sweet rhythm, her hands always busy with meaningful work. In the crisp mornings, she helped the children plant winter wheat, their laughter rising like birdsong as they scattered seeds in the freshly turned earth. Little ones clung to her skirts, begging for stories while they worked. Miss Chloe, show us how deep to plant. Young Sarah would call, and Chloe's patient demonstrations earned her bright smiles and sticky hugs. Between chores, she found herself walking beside James more and more often. They shared quiet moments planning the spring garden, their shoulders nearly touching as they studied his careful drawings. His hand would brush against hers as they loaded hay into the barn, sending warmth through her whole body despite the autumn chill. In the evenings, his voice was gentle as they read scripture together by lamplight, the words seeming to hold new meaning when shared between them. One evening, as the household gathered for supper, unusual tension filled the air. The widows exchanged knowing glances while James cleared his throat several times, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them for grace. After the meal, when the plates were nearly empty, he rose from his seat. The room fell silent. Chloe, he began, his voice wavering but growing stronger. When God led me to build this refuge, I thought my path was clear. But he had greater plans than I knew. James stepped closer to her chair, his eyes full of tender purpose. You came to us, broken, as we all did. Yet your strength and gentle spirit have made this place truly whole. He swallowed hard. I do not wish you to stay only as our helper. Chloe's heart thundered in her chest as James took her hand in his. Would you remain here as my partner? My wife? Help me lead this refuge as God leads us both. Joy burst in Chloe's chest like sunrise. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. The room erupted in cheers and laughter. Margaret Ellis began a hymn, her strong voice soon joined by others. The children danced around the table, clapping with delight. As James drew her to her feet and into a tender embrace, Chloe felt the last wounds in her heart healing. She was no longer the unwanted daughter, the burden to be sold. She had been chosen, cherished, and loved. The morning sun painted the Colorado sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink as Chloe stood at the cabin window. Her heart fluttered like the leaves of the cottonwood trees that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Outside, neighbors were already gathering, carrying dishes and setting up wooden benches in neat rows. Margaret Ellis and the other widows had lovingly draped each bench with colorful quilts, transforming the simple farmyard into something magical. In the small bedroom, Chloe smoothed her hands over the cream-colored dress the women had sewn for her. Each stitch represented hours of loving labor, their way of welcoming her fully into their family. Her trembling fingers touched the delicate wildflowers woven into her braided hair, purple asters and golden prairie sunflowers gathered by the children at dawn. You look like an angel, whispered little Sarah, peeking around the doorframe. The other children crowded behind her, their eyes wide with wonder. The congregation gathered under the spreading cottonwoods, their Sunday best brightening the autumn landscape. James stood waiting, his plain black coat brushed clean, his eyes finding Chloe's as she walked toward him. His gaze held such deep love that tears pricked at her eyes. The pastor's voice carried clearly across the yard as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Chloe barely heard the words, lost in the miracle of the moment. When it came time for their vows, her voice rang out strong and clear, her hand steady in James's as they pledged their lives to each other. "I, Chloe, take thee, James." The words felt like a song in her heart. As the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation burst into song. The hymn rose toward heaven, carried on dozens of voices, swelling with joy and gratitude. Chloe's own rich voice joined in, harmonizing with James's gentle tenor beside her. Later, at the long table set up in the yard, Chloe moved among their guests, serving the bread she had baked herself. Each piece represented her transformation, from unwanted daughter to cherished wife, from outcast to beloved leader of their growing community. Children darted between the tables, playing tag and stealing cookies when they thought no one was. Looking as evening approached, lanterns were lit, casting warm golden light across the celebration. Stories were shared, more hymns sung, and laughter echoed across the prairie. Young ones played Ring Around the Rosie while older folks remembered their own wedding days. When night finally fell in earnest, Chloe slipped away from the gathering. Standing alone under the vast starlit sky, she felt overwhelmed by God's mercy. Here, in this place where no soul was ever cast aside, she had found everything she never dared to dream of: love, purpose, and family. "Thank you," she whispered to the heavens, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you for bringing me home. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart."